Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Rejoining me on the podcast to discuss some of the major moves that happened in the Middle East last week is Kamran Bokhari, who was recently promoted to senior director of Eurasian Security and Prosperity Portfolio at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy. Kamran and I go way back to our Stratfor days. We've been friends and Star Trek fiends for a long time, but in addition to that, there is no better observer of the Muslim world for my money, and Kamran is also an exceptional analyst in other parts of the world too. So he was the obvious person to bring on the podcast to discuss what this deal means for Iran, for Saudi Arabia, for China, India, Turkey. And we also took a little time at the end of the podcast to check in on Kamran's prediction that the Iranian regime's end is coming soon. So thanks so much for listening. As always, you can email me at jacob@cognitive.investments if you have thoughts or comments about this podcast, if you want to tell me about a good book you read, or if you want to find out about the services that we provide, either on a consulting basis or some of our investment services, please email. So otherwise, I think that's all. Cheers and see you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. Kamran, when the apex of the Iranian Leviathan is in the news, who else to explore this murky spatial nexus with other than you? It's nice to see you, my friend.
Well, thank you, Jacob. Always a pleasure to chat, and I hope the world finds the Jacob-Kamran discussions useful.
They absolutely do, and even if they don't, we don't care because we have fun talking to each other. So you're welcome for all of you
that
who
is
are listening
true.
out there. Look, we wanted to bring you on real fast. I know you're literally about to get out the door to Kazakhstan of all places, but we've had some major developments in the Middle East region lately. And I think we need to talk through them, especially because the last podcast that you came on, I believe it was in December, and the title of that podcast was The End of the Iranian Regime. Maybe the end of the Iranian regime is still somewhat in sight, but the regime seems to be kicking at least. It's not going to go down without a fight. Last week, there was big news across the board. So just to recap, on Thursday, there was this Wall Street Journal report that Saudi Arabia was cool with normalizing relations with Israel if the United States gave Saudi Arabia some security guarantees and if the United States supported the Saudi Arabian civilian nuclear development program. Like, okay, like that's a little weird, but you kind of put that in your cap and you think about it. The next day in China, Iran and Saudi Arabia announced renormalization of ties. I think they didn't, I forget if they closed their embassies in 2014, 16, I forget exactly when, but ties have been closed for something like 7 or 8 years. And suddenly there's Iran and Saudi Arabia in China saying, nope, we're going to reopen, embassies. And China was essential in brokering all this. And now everybody's talking about this summit that China wants to help host between the GCC countries and Iran, and China sort of being this big diplomatic heavyweight. And as far as I know, there were no conditions on China. Now, I have some thoughts about that, but I want to lob it over to you. Can you help us make sense of those developments? Because at least superficially, they seem like they're pretty tectonic.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not going to be shy about saying that I think that most of the world, including the Western media and observers, are making too much out of something, or this incident. Basically, look, there's no way that the Saudis and the Iranians are kissing and making up. Okay, the deep-seated geopolitical hostility isn't because of Arab versus Persian necessarily, or Sunni versus Shia. We would love to frame things in those terms, but it has to do with raw power and who has the upper hand, who is more assertive in the region. In this case, it's Iran. Iran has its tentacles deep inside the Arab world. And that's the stage, or that is the strategic environment in which we see the two sides coming together in some form of a deal, agreement brokered by the Chinese. So what I'm trying to say is that think of this as a very temporary ceasefire in a long conflict that has been going on for a while and will continue for a while. So they both need, and we can get into the details later, they both need this truce, if you will. There's a value in it, but it's not for some sort of an agreement. Now, let me quickly shift over to what the Chinese angle. Look, China under Xi, and you know this more than I do because you looked into China far more granularly than I have over the years, but China's economy isn't doing well. Xi has turned China from a bureaucratic authoritarian state into a personalized dictatorship. He needs to show that what is China getting out of all of this. So this is a quick win. This is a low-hanging fruit. Saudi Arabia, alongside Russia, are the major exporters of crude to China. So there's a relationship there. The Saudis are upset with the Americans for a variety of reasons, and we can get into those here in a bit. But it's a fact. And so there's enough incentive to work with the Chinese. Meanwhile, Iran has no friends. Russia is its only friend, and that friend needs more help than Iran right now, or at least the Iranians are the ones giving the Russians more help than the other way around. That leaves China as the only one. The U.S. does not have a relationship with Iran. So, this is like a quick sort of win in that, you get a photo op, you make splash on a global media stage, and you create waves and ripples. But there's nothing substantive there. At this, even right now and for the foreseeable future, China is doing all of this because U.S., for all practical purposes, is providing security for the Arabian Peninsula, Persian Gulf region. I'll draw an analogy. The Chinese built BRI all around Afghanistan because it was the American dollar and American forces that were doing the heavy lifting, making sure that whatever happens in Afghanistan stays there and does not spill over, creating that environment in which China was about to play. It played and made the BRI. And now, since the U.S. withdrawal, they're in a pickle. So what I'm trying to say is that these things have to be kept into the context, as opposed to, Wang Yi having a photo op with Rear Admiral Ali Shamkhani and, the Saudi National Security Advisor on his right and left.
I take your point and would extend your point on sort of the China-U.S. aspects of this, because you mentioned that China is the most important customer of Saudi Arabian oil, Iranian oil. They're importing lots of oil from those two countries. I would say here that China as a customer has all the leverage. So it's not actually that China is dependent on Saudi Arabia and Iran. It's actually that Saudi Arabia and Iran are dependent on China. So when China says to Saudi Arabia, hey, we're going to need to start considering paying for our oil in Chinese yuan, Saudi Arabia has to say yes. Now, the media can spin that as the decline of the dollar, but that's really Saudi Arabia's biggest customer is China. They have to listen. If Wang Yi wants to have a photo op in China with Iran and with Saudi Arabia, both of those countries really have to consider it because of how important China is to them. And that's the other key thing here. We can talk about the personality differences between the Biden White House and between Mohammed bin Salman and Raisi, all these other things. It wasn't that long ago that a U.S. president was doing sword dances and having Toby Keith concerts with Saudi Arabia. So the hatred doesn't run necessarily that deep. But the bigger thing, and I've been writing about this literally since 2021, since I really first joined CI, was that the United States just isn't importing oil from the Middle East anymore. And as long as the United States is not importing almost any Saudi crude, then it doesn't matter what the United States does. The Saudi Arabians don't have to listen to them because they know that their products are kind of going elsewhere. Where I would push back against you and where I'd ask you to sort of dig in a little deeper is it wasn't just a photo op. So like the embassies are reopening again. The lines of communication are going to be open again. They are going to have this summit next year. And when you compare that with, Israel, which has been expecting normalization with Saudi Arabia, it feels like for years, and thought it was in this, anti-Iranian coalition with Saudi Arabia. They're sitting there going, well, wait, I thought Abraham Accords. I thought this was all, I thought we were going to open up embassies with Saudi Arabia before Saudi Arabia was going to open up with Iran. So it's not just the photo op, like the lines of communication, and maybe the lines of communication won't stay open that long. Maybe something will happen in the Yemeni civil war, or Iran will bomb some Saudi oil infrastructure. Like maybe it will all collapse in 3 to 6 months. But it's not just a press release. Like there are some actual moves on a diplomatic level to try and change things around the board. And this is the last point I'd make. Saudi Arabia, for all those reasons that I just talked about, it's not really playing with the United States. It's doing geopolitics on its own. So maybe Saudi Arabia is seeing, hey, this whole thing we had with Iran and expecting the United States to help us with Iran, it hasn't worked for years. We've just been burning through cash to fight this Yemeni, war that we can't win. The bad relationship with Iran's not going anywhere. Maybe we like Iran's version of the world. Maybe we like a multipolar world with a China and a Russia and an Iran and this, that, or the other thing, where not everybody has to bow down to the United States and do things. So it does seem to me like there's hints of that stuff. Tell me where I'm wrong. Tell me where I'm drinking the Kool-Aid.
No, you're not drinking the Kool-Aid. Look, you rightfully point out that there's more. It's more than a photo op, and there are some actionable items, the opening of the embassies and the communication channels and whatnot. What I'm saying is that we just need to wait and see. I mean, I can't imagine the Iranians pledging to no longer play in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, in Lebanon, and because they now have a relationship with the Saudis. I just don't see that happening. I don't see the Saudis trusting the Iranians after everything they've been through, because they've been on the receiving end of Iranian assertiveness, aggression in the Arab world. Mm-hmm. And right now, they understand the United States, since the days of the Obama administration, they got some respite during Trump, where they had the dance, the sword dance and whatnot, and we whacked Soleimani, and that the Saudis cheered us on. But the bottom line is that the United States, regardless of administration and presidential personality, has to manage the whole region. We're not just seeing this thing with Saudi Arabia. Even with Israel, we're seeing this sort of divergence of interest. It's been going on for years now. It's more acute now because of those developments that were in play have now matured. So you're right. The Saudis are trying to figure out a way in which, in a world on their own, with the help of others, in which the United States was not just sort of supporting Saudi Arabia and period. The Saudis have to have a strategy for the United States that will have to deal with some form of, and Iran. We saw that with the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, and now this administration has been trying to revive the JCPOA in some shape or form and has not succeeded. And now Iran is changing as well internally, and so the United States will have to deal with Iran. The Saudis know this; they can't depend on that, which is why they're saying, you know what, I don't care if Russia invades Ukraine. I'm still going to do, business with Russia, and the UAE is also doing the same thing. As for Israel, look, I really have a doubt that the Israelis ever hope to have an embassy in Riyadh anytime soon. I don't think, I think everybody realized that, look, Mohammed bin Salman has a lot on his plate. It's not the UAE, where we've established this relationship and the UAE faces no pressures from inside. So let's take this, one step at a time. And while the Israelis are definitely looking at this and saying, what are the Chinese up to? What are the Saudis up to? How does this benefit the Iranians? Are they coming out from the cold and their isolation is decreasing? These are all valid questions, I think, that the Israelis are grappling with. But I don't think the expectation was that Saudi was going their way and now has sort of done an about face and gone in the other direction. So look, this is quite complicated in the sense that if you are the Saudis, so we can talk about the Iranians separately, but if you are the Saudis, and for the longest time, and I'll go back to the last 10 years, it was in 2013 when the Saudis were very happy that the Obama administration in the summer of 2013 had decided that we're going to go and do airstrikes in Syria in response to the use of chemical weapons. And they were all waiting for it. And what happens? Not only are those airstrikes called off, the Obama administration begins negotiations with the Rouhani government to do the JCPOA. And that is something that has really bruised the Saudis. It has made them realize that, look, the U.S. isn't abandoning us, but we don't have the U.S. the way we used to. And this neighborhood has become, this comes at a time when our neighborhood has become treacherous. It's become really, really risky. We have a fire burning on our southern flank and the northern flank. We barely got through the Arab Spring and kept these lumps under lock and key from exploiting that opening. And we have this Iran, basically barging through the door or multiple doors. So we need a strategy. So they're going to go with China. They're going to go with Russia. They're going to work with the UAE. And apparently there's a UAE-Saudi disagreement also going on. We can't afford to keep fighting with Qatar, hence the rapprochement with Qatar. So look, you keep your friends close and your enemies closer. And I don't think that the Saudis are an exception to that principle.
It wasn't just the Saudis that were bruised by the Obama administration's decision to pull back on the red line. We were at Stratford together at that time, and I went on TV and did an interview and said, yes, the United States is going to bomb Syria as a result of the use of these chemical weapons. And within 48 hours, boy, did I look like a moron. So also my pride and ego was bruised by that decision as well. But that's neither here nor there. I want to talk a little bit more around the line of conversation that we just had, not just about Israel, but I think this means more than Israel and the United States. It means things for India. It means things for Turkey. I mean, there's sort of a lot of regional players here that have stakes in it. But before we get there, I want to drill down a little more because you alluded to it a little bit. But what do you think Saudi Arabia gets out of this, if anything, even if it's a short-term thing, even if it's just a photo op? What do you think Mohammed bin Salman, what's the calculus there? And then on the flip side, what does Iran get? Why did they agree to do this? Because I take your point that neither one of them would have done it if they didn't see something in for themselves and for their geopolitical interests, which are often divergent in that region. So just very specifically for Saudi Arabia and Iran, what does each side see that it gets out of this? Why was this a good move for each of them?
Look, both have an interest in lowering the temperature. And it's been high for a very long time. They both need to recuperate. They both need to reassess. They can do with the reduced tensions, even if it is for a brief period of time. A crude and somewhat awkward analogy is, what happens between Hamas and Israel in the Gaza Strip. You fight, and then you all agree and get the Egyptians to broker a truce until the next time. And this is a cycle. I know it's crude. I know it's not exactly what's happening between Iran and Saudi Arabia, but you get my point. My point is they both can benefit. The Saudis need to find a better way to manage Iran when they have multiple problems, when they have a very dynamic and changing global environment. And if the Chinese can help them achieve this, why not? If you're the Saudis, can you lean on the United States to make Iran behave? No. The Israelis know that as well. This is the biggest problem between the Israelis and the Americans is the Americans say, hey, don't do something on your own. We got this. And the Israelis say, sure. But then the Americans don't do anything. Yeah. They can't do anything because they have no leverage over the Iranians. Mm-hmm. If you're the Saudis, who has leverage? The Russians. Well, right now, Putin is more worried about Ukraine. Oh, okay, let's check with the Chinese. The Chinese say, yeah, I need to show myself as a big emerging power. Yeah, I will do this for you. And even the Saudis know that the purchase that the benefit, that the return on the investment in this deal is limited, but they'll take what they get. Now flip over to the Iranians. You are under sanctions. You have an unprecedented domestic uprising. Your leader is about to kick the bucket. You don't know what is going to happen. And Russia now needs your help as opposed to Russia giving you help. If China comes to you and says, let me help you with this is an opportunity to say, you know what? I'm no longer isolated. U.S., you want to isolate me? You want to keep adding sanctions? Look, the Chinese just did a deal between us and our adversaries, historic adversaries. So they get that mileage out of it, and they also need the respite. It's not like they're pulling out of Syria. It's not like they're going to pull out of anything. Yemen, is this deal, are the Chinese going to broker an agreement between the Saudis and the Iranians over a power sharing between the Houthis in Yemen and their opponents that are pro-Saudi? I seriously doubt it. They're not going to do that. That's way above the Chinese pay grade. This is as far as it gets. The Iranians will take what they get. And in the meantime, they can sort out other issues and they don't look like the bad guy. Because if everything is going wrong, you have the Turks and the Azerbaijanis on your northern flank, and because of what has happened in NK. You don't have Russia anymore. You have the Taliban to worry about on your eastern flank, and you are trying to hold on to your gains that you've made into the Middle East, and you're under sanctions. You're not able to, your currency, has lost 30% of its value since the beginning of this year, and your inflation is at 50%. You could do with reduced tensions. As I said, they'll take what they get.
Yeah, I just wonder if there's something in there, because I take all your points, but when Russia was by itself, it was one thing, and then it was Russia and China by themselves. Okay, these are still mostly isolated countries. Then you throw in Iran. Okay, we're starting to get a little interesting. Now you throw in Saudi Arabia and the entire GCC, and you start to throw in these poll numbers that in the West were very anti-Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Most of the rest of the world either doesn't care or doesn't feel like it has the ability to care because it depends on Russia for fertilizers, or it depends on China as an export market, or for all these other things. So like if you start putting together that world, if you can get an India to come on board with you, or a Brazil now, and it's this alternative, we still have opposition geopolitically, but we can trade and we have all these other interests, like maybe there's something there. But to buttress what you were saying, though, I think, and the Wall Street Journal report the day before the Saudi Arabia, China, Iran deal, I think really got swept away, because it wasn't just that Saudi Arabia asked for U.S. security guarantees as part of some deal to recognize Israel. That thing about civilian nuclear program also made the hair stand up on the back of my neck, because it sounds to me like, Israel has nuclear weapons. Iran, if it doesn't have them, is close to getting them. Did the Saudis just telegraph that they're going to go get nuclear weapons too? Because if you don't trust the United States anymore, and you're just doing this brief photo op deal, but you're living in this very precarious geopolitical environment, I would think that the next move for the Saudis is, okay, maybe we need nuclear weapons to protect against all contingencies, because nobody else is going to stop Iran from getting them. Do you think I'm being too alarmist there, or do you see sort of the shadow of a nuclear arms race budding in the Middle East?
Oh, absolutely. Look, not that the Saudis are going to gain access to nuclear technology because of the very nature of how long it takes to develop and harness it. Look at the Iranians. They've been at it for decades, and they still haven't reached that. They still haven't gotten enough. Well, according to, a top Pentagon official, if they made the political decision, then, within 12 days, they could have enough fissile material worth one bomb. But that doesn't mean they have a bomb. They just have fissile material, and if they're not careful, they can irradiate a significant portion of their own population if they didn't know the know-how. So the Saudis do want to have a counterweight, but I just don't see how a civilian nuclear program will help the Saudis against the Iranians, who are at the cusp of nuclear weapons.
Well,
So
because
unless
they'd be lying about it, Kamran, because it's not a civilian nuclear Well, they could use like nuclear power too, but they have enough oil. That they'd be saying, "Hey, Iran claims it has a civilian nuclear program of its own. So, like, if you want to deal with us, United States, we'd like civilian nuclear expertise." I bet the Chinese are going to give them "quote unquote" civilian nuclear expertise. I wouldn't think that the Chinese are going to be shy about giving that to the Saudis. But sorry, I interrupted you. I just think it's
no,
because
you
they're
actually
lying.
you read my mind. You basically, that's what I was going to say, is that this civilian nuclear program seems to be a euphemism for the Saudis to say, "Hey, we want nukes." If you say to the Western press, "I want nukes," guess what will happen? But if you say, "I want a civilian nuclear program," well, they are still politically correct, and there's nothing wrong with it, unless people like you and I start to pick it apart and say, "Well, what does that really mean? Wait a second. How do you fight nuclear weapons with a civilian nuclear program?" But yes, you're absolutely right. I will also draw your attention to another report that came out just in the past few days while all of this was going on with China and the whole deal between Saudis and the Iranians, is the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund, if I'm correct, is allocating money for the Saudis to purchase a large fleet of Boeing jets. So the dependency on the United States isn't going away. As I said, the United States still provides and will continue to provide for security. We're not pulling the Fifth Fleet out of Bahrain. We're not pulling out of Kuwait. We're not pulling out of any of those bases, Al Udeid in Qatar, and the facilities that we have in UAE. So, let the U.S. do. The U.S. isn't going anywhere. So it's almost as if the Saudis have this sense of comfort as well, while they're worried that it's not like the old days, and they have a genuine concern. But if you're Saudi and you're saying, if I go to the Chinese, will the Americans withdraw troops from the region? No, they're not going to do that, because they're not going to do that for their own purposes. It's not that they're going to do us any favor or withdraw the favor. So might as well, we have U.S. troops. Great. Now we can get the Chinese involved to the extent that they can. Meanwhile, there's India and the UAE and Israel and the United States doing, the U2I2 alliance, which is at this stage seems to be a forum in which technology and finance and geopolitics are all working together, but it's a work in progress. So what I'm saying is that this isn't a zero-sum game. And if the Chinese are getting a small piece of the action, sure. Look, let's sort of do a little exercise here. Let's ask why this hasn't happened before. It's not like the Chinese yesterday got to this point where then they said, "Hey, we're going to get the Iranians and the Saudis together, and we're going to be seen as this mediator and peacemaker." They could have done this. They've been importing oil from Saudi Arabia for a very long time. The Iranians have been leaning on them for a very long time. The Chinese have a need to show that they can compete with the United States, and the United States does not have a monopoly over different regions. And so this is something. Why is it that it happened just now? And my view is that it has a lot to do with what is happening with Xi, because what's in it for him? We already talked about what's in it for the Iranians and what's in it for the Saudis. And what are the Chinese getting out of it? They could have, if it was just to show that, we are now playing major league geopolitics, they could have done this a while ago. So I think there's something there, and it is about the domestic situation in China, and it's, what are they going to do? I mean, we hear about the impending invasion of Taiwan. Okay, great. When is that going to happen? They did BRI, didn't go anywhere. They are, after $62 billion, Pakistan is about to default, and the Chinese are about to lose their money. And the Chinese and the Pakistanis are saying, "Could you restructure our loans?" And they're saying, "We're not the IMF. Are you crazy?" And so, if you look at all of this, and then you look at Sri Lanka, you look at this string of pearl strategy in the Indian Ocean, none of this has really panned out. So yes, they're doing different things. And even if you look at the strategic poking of India on the Himalayas, they're not using live firearms. I mean, it's more posturing. There's more fistfights with Indian forces. So I think this is a low-cost way of trying to distract from what's happening on the domestic front, and it's of value to to at least the Chinese leadership, led by Xi himself.
Yeah, I think there's also something to the idea that China benefits if Iran is welcomed back into the world order, and if it's not tight with the United States. So if there was a chance of sort of an Iran-U.S. rapprochement and the JCPOA, maybe it doesn't mean as much for China. But if China can bring on all of Iran's oil and natural resources and can be credited for being the one that brings Iran back in, that could be interesting too. But let's turn to some other players here, because you're right that it is interesting for other countries in the region. The first I think we have to talk about is Turkey, which is having a very difficult year already. And it doesn't look like this is going to be a very easy year for Turkey with their elections coming up in May and sort of lack of certainty of what's going to happen with Erdogan. Do you think that Turkey views this as threatening? Do you think that Turkey sort of nods at this and says, good, like in a multipolar world, it's nice that we need Iran and Saudi Arabia balancing against each other, and we like having China around. We think we can export things to China. We have our own deals with China on the side. Do you think Turkey likes the idea of China, which is going to be a less assertive power than the United States in the region? Or do you think that Turkey looks at this and maybe looks back towards the United States and is like, maybe we shouldn't turn our backs on the U.S. so much?
Yeah, I think that this isn't something that the Turks are looking at and leaping with joy. They are looking at this and they're saying, we're busy with our internal stuff. We just had a major earthquake. We're dealing with the fallout of Ukraine. We're trying to benefit from the balance of power shifting in Nagorno-Karabakh. We're trying to get into Central Asia. And we're just trying to normalize relationships with Egypt, Israel, UAE, Saudi, and now we have this. So I wouldn't be surprised if they're still sort of trying to figure this out and say, how does this hurt or help us? Look, if there's going to be a competitor or someone that's going to challenge Turkey, and it's already challenging Turkey in many ways, or blocking Turkey in the Middle East, it's Iran. So they're not going to look at this and say, this works for us. A more multipolar world is good for us. The other thing here is that China's efforts with respect to Iran are tied to Central Asia, if you just think spatially. Mm-hmm. So a few months, I would say 3 or 4 months before the Taliban took over Afghanistan, there was this big another photo op between the then Iranian foreign minister and the former top diplomat of China, Mr. Wang Yi, and they now have a new foreign minister. So the deal and the occasion was the signing of an agreement where the Chinese pledged to invest $400 billion over a 25-year period, bringing BRI into Iran and extending it to the Persian Gulf. Mm-hmm. Now, where do you extend it from? You extend it from Turkmenistan. You have to connect through Tajikistan. And that whole Central Asian network of BRI infrastructure. So, yes, there's value, long-term value for China to play with Iran. Now, the Turks are also eyeing Central Asia for their own purposes. They more than the Europeans and I would say the Americans want this Trans-Caspian energy corridor because it will allow them to reduce dependency on Russia, mm-hmm. And it would make them the energy transit state that they've always dreamed of becoming. And if China is coming in and playing with Iran, then there's competition there. And it's kind of like, well, we just kind of made a gain against Iran in the South Caucasus, and now we're having the Saudis and the Iranians, helped by the Chinese, working on some sort of an agreement. That can't be good for the Turks. I mean, at least I don't see what benefit that the Turks can get out of it. I can see how they might feel that they no longer have the edge. One of the things that I've been arguing for some time is that as the Russian ability to project influence is waning, whether it's in Central Asia, the South Caucasus, the broader Black Sea region, and beyond, the Turks come in and fill that space. And so if China is upsetting that calculus or coming into that space and creating conditions that have forced the Turks to recalculate and re-strategize, then that can't be good for Ankara.
And maybe Ankara will start giving a damn about the Uyghurs in Xinjiang as well if they see that as a rivalry. Do you think it's a bridge too far to suggest that Saudi Arabia may start to think that Turkey is actually the bigger long-term rival to its interests than Iran? Is that too pie in the sky? I say that because Saudi Arabia, Muslim, like a Sunni Muslim country primarily, although, the Wahhabist stuff is very strange, but, the areas of the Middle East that Turkey seems to be muscling into and where Turkey has a real pull are the areas where you would expect an Arab Sunni Muslim leader to emerge. Whereas there are just, Iran's already experienced this. There are constraints to how much Iran can push in because they're not Arab. They're not even Sunni. Like they can do little tiny things in places like, okay, Lebanon's screwed up and Syria's screwed up, but that control is very tenuous and it's always going to be hard for Iran to project power over that much geography. So is it crazy to say that maybe Saudi Arabia is thinking Turkey is the threat, or is that, do you think that has any ring of truth to that?
Yeah, look, I mean, you're absolutely right. And I don't know if you were on leave at that time in 2015 and doing your graduate degree, or it was earlier, but in early 2015, just before I left Stratford, I did a series of long pieces on how there are limits to how far the Iranian power can extend itself because they run into natural barriers. Mm-hmm. You're up against the Arab ethnicity. You're up against you're pushing against the other side of the sectarian divide. Yep. And then there are linguistic issues and so on and so forth. So but the Iranians had a benefit in the sense that the Sunni camp was divided, or still is divided. At the time, ISIS was vying for the leadership of the Sunnis. Turkey was trying to emerge as a Sunni power. The Arabs were worried about Turkey pushing in while they were dealing with an aggressive Iran. So to answer your question, I don't think that the Saudis would like to fight Iran in a way that empowers Turkey. So, it makes sense intuitively that if Turkey plays a bigger role in the Middle East, then at least Iran can be countered, assuming, the situation in Syria can be reversed, and Iraq, where right now the Iranians have the upper hand, and somehow Turkey gains the upper hand. But then in order to neutralize the Iranian threat, the price is too high for the Saudis and the Arabs, which is to sort of go back to Turkish hegemony, if you will, or giving Turkey too much influence in their region. So I think that, yes, the Saudis want to sort of balance as opposed to be this, singular fear of the Iranians. They also have to be careful about not empowering the Turks in the process. Right now, and increasingly so since the Arab Spring uprising, Saudi Arabia is the only Arab state that is a major country that, and along with UAE, but it's a much smaller scale country, that is shouldering representing the Arabs. All other Arab powers have declined. Iraq has fallen into Iran's orbit. It used to be a big power under the Ba'athis. Syria has, is no longer that power that it used to be. Egypt has tanked. Egypt is now, only so many years behind Pakistan in terms of becoming an economic mess. And so So in that circumstance, on one hand, you have the Iranians, and the other hand, you have the Turks. And if you're Saudi Arabia, you need to balance. You can't be comfortable. You can't be. You have to be able to have a plan to manage both.
Yeah. This is an aside because I want to ask you about India as well in this context, but you mentioned Saudi Arabia. Cousin Marco Papic, who comes on this podcast, A Fair Deal, he didn't say this on the podcast, but I saw him at a conference last week compare the nation building that's happening inside of Saudi Arabia to the Meiji Restoration in Japan in the late 1800s. His point being that, Saudi Arabia is really going through incredible socioeconomic evolution and is becoming a modern nation state in a way that it hasn't for hundreds of years. Do you buy that? I instinctively think that that's nonsense, but I will say that, and maybe it's just because oil prices are high, but when you look at some of the things that Saudi Arabia is doing, it's kind of hard. I mean, I don't think you have to go Meiji Restoration. That's like Marco's hyperbole. But do you feel like something is changing fundamentally in Saudi Arabia? Are they becoming a modern nation state, or is that just not in the cards for their sort of weird theocratic compromise between, tribes and Wahhabis and everything else?
So I think cousin Marco has a point. I wouldn't call it the Meiji Restoration or compare it to that, but he does have a point. I do see Saudi Arabia evolving, and it's been an ongoing thing for at least, I would say, well over a decade. But it's been accelerated under MBS, at least since 2015, 2017. And so I think that that's happening. But this is all new. How does Saudi Arabia jettison? Look, the first Saudi state that laid the foundations for the Saudi Wahhabi alliance was in 1744, even before the founding of the United States. And that state lasted well over 8 decades. And then, the Ottomans through the Egyptians came in and knocked it down. And a few years later, there was a second Saudi state in 1820. 1818 is when the first Saudi state collapses. 1824 is when it's restored. It's not the same scale or size, but it remains, and it lasts until about 1892. And then you have, that period between the decline of the Ottoman Empire, World War I, and the interwar period. And then in 1932, you have the modern kingdom established. The point that I'm making is that traditional Saudi Arabia that was Wahhabi, that was tribalistic, and that was built on petrodollars, you just can't do away with that legacy in a short span of a decade at max. So the jury is out, but yes, there is significant change in the climate. I mean, one of the things that I want to point out is, in many ways, MBS has basically demonstrated that even his father and definitely his uncles were afraid of a boogeyman called the Wahhabi establishment. Why? Because he neutered them in a significant way, or at least has, put them under lock and key for the time being, something that was unthinkable for the longest time. The idea was that there are 3 pillars of Saudi society, the Saudi state. There is oil, there's tribalism, and then there is Islam, Wahhabi, version. And if you mess with any of those, this edifice will come tumbling down. That hasn't happened. And in many ways, the Saudis have, MBS has basically said, you guys were afraid of nothing. Look, well, the argument, one can argue that the timing is right, because right now you have a situation where Saudi society has evolved. There are a lot more women out there in society and the workforce. There is a large youth population, and all of them don't want to be under the tribal, ultra-conservative religious paradigm, if you will. So he has something to build his modern Saudi Arabia on. We just need to see how long this goes. And the one thing that there is economic prosperity, He's given social freedoms. But for all of this to endure, he needs a political system. Will Saudi Arabia become, and I've written this question, I've written this in the form of a question in a piece, that will MBS be the one to turn Saudi Arabia into a constitutional monarchy where you provide for some sharing of power with the public so that it doesn't sort of snatch it from you in some form of an uprising, especially if the economics don't really pan out. So that's still out there. So cousin Marco isn't, wrong, but I think that maybe he is getting a little ahead of himself.
Yeah, the cart is before the camel, if you will. But I am reminded of that scene in Game of Thrones where Cersei is talking to have you seen Game of Thrones, Kamran, or is that not in your universe?
I am so much, into the Star Trek world that I've never found time for it.
Okay, well, I'm an equal opportunity fantasy nerd. So anyway, there's this scene where Cersei Lannister is talking to Littlefinger, and Littlefinger says, "Knowledge is power," and she's got some guards with her, and she says, "Guards, like, kill him." "Oh, wait, no, I changed my mind. Arrest him." "No, go over there." And she goes at him and goes, "Power is power." And then she walks away and drops the mic. Spoiler alert. So if you haven't seen Game of Thrones, you can fast forward a little bit.
You've got me intrigued.
Well, then I shouldn't tell you. Well, so anyway, we'll just say that Cersei's interpretation of power is good in the short term, but it doesn't work for her in the long term. And so, yes, I'm saying maybe MBS should get wise to that. The second thing, though, you said there is very interesting, which is the idea that women have a freer role in Saudi society. And I think relative to the role that women play in Western societies, we would still characterize how women are treated in Saudi society is fairly medieval. But I think you're right that relative to what they experienced even 10 years ago, there has been a big change. And I'm not sure that there is a bigger force for economic development and the end of poverty than empowering women. And if you're empowering women even a little bit in Saudi Arabia, maybe you get that wind underneath your sails. I would just think that once you give the population a little bit of freedom, they're going to want more. And I don't know how somebody like MBS handles that. But let's not get too tied down to that. You talked about Turkey a little bit. I wonder if you have a perspective on India and how India might react to this. Does India care? Does it not care? It seems to me that India is this other country that's going to be importing oil from the Middle East. And if Saudi Arabia is in the front of the line, if China is in front of the line dictating terms with Saudi Arabia and Iran, does India have to worry about a future in which China can say to Iran and Saudi Arabia, don't export to the Indians because they did something mean to us in the Himalayas or because they tried to block us at the Strait of Malacca? Do you think they're playing that sort of long-term game? Or is India really just pragmatic and is like, great, China, we'd rather have a power that doesn't care so much about Iran. We want to import their oil as well. Do you think India sees any threat in this at all or thinks this is fundamentally a good thing?
That's actually an excellent question, and it's something that's not being discussed, at least in the public conversation around this whole China-brokered Iran-Saudi Arabia deal, which is the role of India. Look, India and China are competitors. The Chinese, as I said earlier, their strategy for the Indian Ocean basin hasn't panned out. They're already trying to ensure that the Indians do not project power because India's economy is rising while the Chinese economy, its heyday is behind it. I'm not saying it can't happen again, but, in this moment, the Chinese economy isn't looking hot and the Indian economy is. So they're poking them strategically in the Himalayas to force them to devote and dedicate resources that could go into maritime power projection. The Chinese know that and vice versa. The Indians know they're both competing for influence in Iran. So yes, this bothers India, both because this could be a way for the Chinese to counter India aligning with the United States, and there is that angle of there is the component of this alignment that sinks in with the Middle East, the one that I talked about earlier, the four-nation alignment called U2I2, which is India, Israel, UAE, and the United States. So yeah, this is worrying the Indians that if China is going to start playing diplomacy, then what does it do? But I don't think that the Indians are too worried about it, because the Indians have their relationship with the Gulf states. It is pretty robust. And India is I said, they, in the history of aviation acquisition, they just made the biggest ever deal for $135 billion, nearly 500 jets from both majors, Boeing and Airbus. So India isn't that worried, but it has to keep an eye on what China is doing to circumvent it, to prevent it from rising, to prevent it from playing in the Persian Gulf. I mean, the India has a lot of influence in UAE, in Saudi Arabia, to the point that in the past 10, 15 years, the Saudis and the Arab states are now more friendly with India than they are with Pakistan, their traditional ally.
Yeah.
In fact, there's been a snubbing of Pakistan on the part of the GCC states, which has worked in India's favor. So India has its own relationship in this region, on both sides of the Persian Gulf, with the Arabian Peninsula states, with Iran. And it'd be interesting to see how India and China compete. I would argue that at this point, despite the fact that China imports most of its crude from Saudi Arabia, and it imports far more crude, and it has a far bigger economy than the Indians, but I think that the Indians are far more better placed in the Middle East, in that Indian Ocean basin, because they're native to it, whereas the Chinese are an outside power.
Well, I think the Indians they don't import as much oil as the Chinese. I'm pretty sure I'm right about that, but they did overtake China as the fastest growing oil importer. So their growth cycle is kicking off. I take your point, though, and this is why if I was advising someone in the Indian government, my alarm bells would go up a little bit here, because if you go back hundreds of years, when before India was taken over by the British Empire, India was a center of economic gravity for parts of East Africa, the Horn of Africa, parts of the Middle East. I mean, there were times where Indian currency was the dominant currency in these parts of the world. So if China is going to try and cut in front of the line and usurp India's role here, I would be a little worried about what that says about China's intentions going forward. Kamran, before I let you get out of here, this has been great. I also have to ask you about, maybe we can just do the last 5-10 minutes on this, the future of the Iranian regime. Because the last time we talked, the protests were rolling. Khamenei was sick. He was sending his son out to do his bidding. It looked like the knives were coming out and everybody was sharpening up for a conflict. It looks like, I don't know, Khamenei got a steroid shot, or he did, got in the hyperbaric chamber. I don't know what else. He seems to be around again and giving speeches and saying things. The protests, even though the economic situation there has gotten worse, have died down a little bit. So there's protest fatigue, or the Iranian security forces cracked enough skulls. I'm not sure. I'm sure you saw that big announcement of amnesty for tens of thousands of protesters too. So they feel confident enough that they can, give an amnesty and still maintain control of the situation. So, I mean, you may be right that the regime is sclerotic and will eventually fall apart. But, I was sort of ready to count them out, and it looks like they're not. In the Monty Python phrase, they're not quite dead yet. They're still kind of moving along and still pushing back. So where are you at on your assessment of where the Iranian regime is at?
Yeah, I think that we probably, chose the wrong title for the for that podcast. But if we go back to that conversation, because I recently wrote a piece and I went back and I listened to our conversation. I think it was like a week ago or something, and I'm still there. I mean, we basically, what I was saying is, look, the protests can't overthrow the regime. The protests are just making it worse for the regime. The regime's fundamentals are flawed and weak, and there's no turning around. There's no way for them to turn it around, because you have a leader that's, what is he going to, if he lives another year, 2 years, that's still, it's not like he's going to live forever and this system is going to endure. There are processes that are gnawing at the structure of the Islamic Republic that just can't be reversed. They can be amplified, and the protests and the unrest, while it's been quieted down, because, I never expected the protests to continue ad infinitum until the end of the regime. But I think that this should be treated as cyclical. I think that there was fatigue, and then of course, there's this huge course of apparatus that people run up against, and then when the euphoria kind of drops, and unfortunately that rubber meets the road, then you do see a petering out of the protests, which is where we are right now. But I think that it's not like the people can be cowed down. There's going to be something else, some other shoe that's going to drop, and then something else will spark more riot. So I look at public unrest as in waves, and that's what we've seen since at least 2017. There have been multiple waves of protests, each subsequent one more bigger than the last one. So I look at the public unrest as something that's still unfolding. There are other chapters to be written in this saga, but the biggest thing is that there is no way for this regime to continue as it is. Something's got to give. And once Khamenei is no more, there's going to be a restructuring of the state. And if it doesn't restructure, then it's going to run into problems. And from what I'm hearing from people who are organizing on the ground, one of the things that I keep hearing is that there is an effort now to develop a leadership as opposed to having spontaneous protests. There are outside actors, expat Iranians are syncing up with Iranian groups inside to try and develop an indigenous leadership to be able to take forward their demands on the regime. And they're trying to make allies in the government because there are people inside the state, stakeholders, both in the Revolutionary Guards and the civilian side, who think that whatever's been going on is very, very dangerous, and there's a need to reconnect with the masses. So I think there's a lot that is going to unfold in Iran, and the process of evolutionary regime change that's been in play, we'll see it accelerate, we'll see it slow down, there'll be turns and twists. It's not linear, like everything else is not linear, but I think there is a trend line that's not reversible. And the trend line is this state has to evolve, and if it doesn't evolve, then it cannot endure.
Yeah, I wouldn't be too hard on yourself. I mean, the title of that podcast was The End of the Iranian Regime, and that could still be at play. There was a reason you weren't talking about Iranian Revolution 2.0, because you're really not talking about a revolution. The depressing part of what you're saying, and tell me if this is the wrong way to interpret what you're saying, is that, one of the scenarios, and probably the most likely scenario, is that whenever the supreme leader kicks the bucket, is that the IRGC will successfully engage in state capture, and they will be the ones that control the Iranian regime, and they will appoint whatever puppet they want in that theocratic role. But the IRGC will basically take over the country, because it doesn't seem to me like Rouhani and the pragmatists and the centrists and the reformists have the juice to compete, especially with all the state capture and economic capture they've already been doing. You could see it the other way. I mean, maybe, I know Rouhani tried a little bit to defang parts of the IRGC and reverse some of their gains, but I think the thesis that you have is that that's what's going to happen. One of these factions that's been battling is going to inhabit, and maybe it'll be the same structures, superficially, but one of these factions will probably take over, and that will be a fundamentally different regime than the one that was there before. Is that fair, or am I misreading you?
No, that's fair. That's a good summary, and I would just add that the trick for the IRGC is that it can't do it alone, and we discussed why it can't do it alone in the last podcast. And therefore, I think that it has an interest in syncing with disaffected portions of the public, some of the protesters, some of those who aren't for like total change and, are non-compromising, but those who are looking for allies within the state to effect meaningful change. And I wouldn't count, the pragmatic conservatives and the reformists out just yet, because the IRGC needs to look like it's a constitutional, anything that it does is still within the constitutional framework, and that it's actually voicing, if it's to succeed as the center of gravity of a new Iranian system, then it needs allies. So I wouldn't count out the likes of Rouhani or others, maybe not Rouhani himself. I don't know, he may not be around by then, or he may not be much of a political player, but you get my point. I mean, they need actors like this who have some following in society, and they need to find new friends. I mean, friends among the protesters who are as non-compromising and are willing to be pragmatic. So this will be interesting to watch, because if that doesn't happen, the IRGC, for as powerful as it is right now, I doubt that on its own it can deal with the pressures from below and from above, or laterally. There's the regular armed forces that are numerically more larger than the IRGC. They have to worry about them. They're not going to play ball. They're already very upset that why does IRGC have all this privilege and influence? And then there is the million-man militia that technically is under the control of the IRGC, at least since 2009, the Basij. But they're really ideological zealots, so they may not be as compromising. So this is going to be a difficult balancing act for the IRGC if it can engage in it.
Well, and the IRGC never really liked the JCPOA, to continue our acronym thing. So if I was the IRGC, China and Mohammed bin Salman and maybe some of these other countries are the types of friends that I would also need in place to make some sort of move. Kamran, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Have a safe trip to Kazakhstan, and we will check in with you when you get back, okay?
Looking forward to it.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.